So that lets you know the webinar for today is being recorded, and you will receive an email later with the copy of the recording if you wish so. So APS membership gives you easy access to valuable career information and resources like this webinar, and allows you to get your research out to the community and network with potential colleagues, employees, our meetings, and have a great positive impact about issues that are important to you through grassroots advocacy. It can also help connect you with a community or like-minded folks through participation in on forums, divisions, and topical groups. So if you're not yet an APS member, but value the things that we provide, we will encourage you to consider joining today. So before we introduce our speaker for the day, we're just going to do some housekeeping for the webinar of today. So as you already know, the webinar, it is being recorded. So if you want to introduce questions as we move forward, we will put a link to a Padlet board on the chat, and we will also have a QR code later on that you can access for writing your questions in the Padlet board. Also, the slides are available on the Padlet board, and you can also submit your questions via chat. So the webinar, please keep it like, keep your audio settings off as the speakers is talking. And we would have an open Q&A question at the end as well. Lastly, before we dive in, I wanted to mention that there is a huge variety of talks prepared for this series, and also we're working on a new series related to the US career development for international physicists that will be launched in July, and it's free to the public. To learn about all the different opportunities and make sure you don't miss this great discussion, so if you haven't already done so, sign up for the main webinars mailing list, which is the link that you can see in there. So with that, I will introduce our wonderful speaker, and we'll put the QR code accessible to you. Oh, sorry, Rose, can you actually put that on the chat? I forgot to say that. So Tawanda Johnson is a senior press secretary in the APS Office of External Affairs, formerly known as Office of Government Affairs. She received her bachelor's degree in journalism from Syracuse University and her master's degree in strategic public relations from the George Washington University. Tawanda began her professional career as a journalist, publishing in variety of regional journals covering issues such as municipal government, police, education, including science, entertainment, and diversity issues. And she has been at APS for 14 years. She's a member of the APS Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Working Group and the APS cross-organizational groups. So I will stop share and let Tawanda introduce, and I'll put the slides up. Wanda, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you so much, Claudia, for that wonderful introduction. It is a pleasure indeed to be here. As she mentioned, I have been working at APS for approximately 14 years. My primary task in my role is to help APS members write op-eds that advance our science policy goals. So the first thing we're going to do is talk about what is an op-ed. So a little bit of a history about that. Op-eds typically appear opposite the editorial page of a newspaper. So on the left side, you would have an editorial, which represents the newspaper's position on particular issues. And then opposite that, you would have other columnists or writers advocating for various issues too. So hence the name op-ed, as in the op-ed appears opposite the editorial of the newspaper. Editorials provide a publication's position on an issue, but op-eds give other writers opportunities to expand on certain issues. Next slide. So op-eds are read by practically everyone. They're one of the most read parts of a newspaper. So in this quote here, this is an advertisement for ads that would appear in an op-ed, on an op-ed page in the New York Times. So I'll read it to you. It says, "In this space, thoughts fly, views are expressed, visions unfurl. It is this page that policymakers look at first, along with captains of industry, masters of the arts, and many of the great thinkers of this generation." So after reading that, who wouldn't want to write an op-ed, right? You know that your piece is going to be read by really, really important people, perhaps even members of Congress if you're advocating for policy change. So it's definitely something to think about because it's going to be read by a wide variety of people. Next slide. What are the benefits of an op-ed? So before you decide that you want to write an op-ed, consider the benefits. It gives you an opportunity to reach decision makers without relying on a reporter. It's also one of the most read pages following the front page of a newspaper. So as a former reporter, I can attest to the importance of an op-ed. So as a reporter, I would have to present both sides of an issue, right? I would have to present the pros and cons of a particular issue. But with an op-ed, you're allowed to solely focus on your argument. You don't have to worry about both sides of a particular issue. So that's one of the benefits of an op-ed. Moving into newsworthy tenets. So again, before you write an op-ed, you should think about, is it newsworthy? So we're going to talk about some tenets of newsworthiness. So one of the tenets of newsworthiness is immediacy. Is it new? Is it something that we've never heard about? In this piece here that I've pulled for you from CNN.com, Dr. James Phillips writes about being a physician on the front lines of COVID. He makes it personal. And in the highlighted part of the op-ed here, he writes, "I will likely become infected in the next few months." So he makes it personal. It's new. It's something we've never heard of, right? I mean, this was a pandemic that just took us all by storm, right? It upended our lives. It impacted our loved ones. It made us work differently. And so you have a physician here who's writing about something new that we had never heard of before, and he personalized the issue. So that made it really important. I'm sure caught the editor's eye and made that editor want to run this piece. The next tenet, proximity. Think about proximity. Is what you're writing about something that's happening in your hometown, for example, in your neighborhood, in your community of your work environment, for example. So full disclosure here with this piece, my daughter, Autumn Johnson, she wrote this piece for the New Pittsburgh Courier last year, just as the Black Lives Matter movement was gaining strength. And so what she did was she likened her own experience with the Black Lives Matter movement to that of my mother, her grandmother, who marched with Dr. Martin Luther King during the Civil Rights Movement. And she writes, "I am heartened by the diversity of the protesters throughout the world, including people who have marched in Washington, D.C. and in my community of Columbia, Maryland." So the Black Lives Matter movement had its own strength here in her community. And so she was very excited to be a part of that. And so it was something that was happening right here. She made it personal again. So proximity, that's something to consider when you're writing an op-ed. Oddity, the bizarre, the unexpected. Is this op-ed something new and interesting or strange in a fun kind of way? So this piece here that I pulled for you deals with getting rid of your GPS. If you could imagine that, I can't imagine doing away with any of my electronic devices. But in this piece, he argues that we ought to do that because of brain changes that could occur if we solely rely on the use of GPS-equipped devices. And he writes, "When people are told which way to turn, it relieves them of the need to create their own routes and remember them. They pay less attention to their surroundings, and neuroscientists can now see that brain behavior changes when people rely on turn-by-turn direction. So I thought after reading this, am I doing harm to my brain? Should I really consider giving up my GPS-equipped device? I think I ended up with the answer being no, but I'll take the chance. But again, this was something new, something interesting we had never heard of before, right? So I'm sure an editor thought, okay, let's run this piece because it's interesting. It's not something I've read before about someone advocating to give up their GPS-equipped device. Conflict, clash of ideologies. So when you're writing an op-ed, think about the possibility of conflict. That doesn't mean that your op-ed has to have conflict in it, but it's something that an editor might look for. So in this piece here, we're talking about the minimum wage debate. Should it be raised to $15? Should it not be? So the Democrats frame the issue as a moral issue. They say that, you know, people are poor, they're struggling, they really need to earn $15 an hour. But corporate interests have another take, right? They say, okay, if we raise these, raise the rate, the minimum wage, then we might have to hire fewer people. And so, you know, we don't want to do that, right? So think about, you know, does your op-ed generate a conflict? Does it generate some sort of clash? And that might be a way to attract an editor's attention. Emotions. Sympathy, anger, empathy, joy, gladness, all of these can attract an editor's attention and get your op-ed published. In this piece here, which I work with Dr. Jessica Winter, she's actually a researcher at Ohio State University. She was advocating for more money in the federal funding budget, but the Trump administration had actually proposed budget cuts. Well, Jessica is a breast cancer survivor, and she actually relied on therapies that were funded by government-supported research. And so in talking with her about this piece, I said to her, you know, Jessica, you have a really powerful story. I said, if you're comfortable, you ought to put that out front. And she thought about it, and she said, you know, I am. She said, because it's really only because of government-supported research that I've had the therapies that I've had to help me battle breast cancer. And so, as you can see here, she wrote, at the age of 35, I was diagnosed with breast cancer. It has been almost 6 years since that fateful day, and my life has been forever changed, and so has my perspective on the role of science in our society. Boy, she really brings home the point about the importance of funding scientific research with that. And she creates the emotion of having battled breast cancer for the reader. Next slide. So now we're going to go into some writing tips. So when you're writing, when you're actually ready, you've thought about the tenets of newsworthiness, you've thought about, you know, why you want to do this. What should you do? How should you write it? Most op-eds are between 600 and 800 words. Sometimes you'll see some publications get up to, I've seen as many as maybe 1,200 words. But what you shouldn't do is think about writing a dissertation. So you want to make it should be succinct, it should be tight. It should really, really capture the editor's attention. That first paragraph really ought to grab that editor, because it's really hard, honestly, to get an op-ed published. Editors receive hundreds of op-ed submissions every single day. In some publications, like your Washington Post and your Wall Street Journals, they get even thousands, I would imagine. And so you have to make sure that you check the submission guidelines, read op-eds to get a sense of those other pieces published by that paper or that online site. What you don't want to do is submit something that doesn't fit with that particular publication. So for example, if you were writing about scientific research, you might pitch to Science. If you were writing about cars, you might pitch to an auto mechanic magazine. But make sure you're familiar with what that publication publishes. Otherwise, most editors will just hit the delete button, unfortunately. And so you want to make sure that what you're submitting matches up with what that publication typically prints. In addition, make sure you have something fresh to say. I think it's important that you move an argument forward, if you will. If you're writing about a particular issue and that point of view that you have on it is already out there. It's been written about, people have seen it. You don't want to continue to write about that. You want to have something fresh to say. You want to think about a new take on the issue. And don't be afraid to really be confident in the position that you have, right? You're an authority on something, right? You feel strongly about this issue. Maybe you're a scientist and you feel strongly about the importance of federally funded science budgets. Maybe you're a baker and you feel passionate about, baking cakes. I mean, whatever your take is, whatever you feel strongly about, you should be able to make that argument in the op-ed. Also, develop one idea and support it with concrete examples. I can't underscore this enough. I think that that first paragraph has to be really, really tight. An op-ed rises and falls based on the first few sentences. Editors will hit the delete button. If it's something that they can't kind of wrap their heads around immediately, if they're struggling to figure out where you're going with it, they'll just hit the delete button, unfortunately. So again, you want to make sure that you write your paragraph tight, that you have that one idea that you're focused on, and you have those concrete examples to back it up. Additional tips: use factual, researched information to back up your opinion. It's good to have an opinion on an issue, but it's even better if you have some researched information to back up that opinion. So if there's a report that supports whatever particular point you're making, if there is a group that also supports what you're advocating for, that you put that information in your op-ed, and also make sure you have links to those op-eds too, because these days, especially, editors are really doing rigorous checking and making sure that what you're saying is accurate. They don't want to get caught out there and hear blowback from their readers that, oh, this is wrong, you got this all wrong. So you want to make sure that you back up with your research information. Tell personal stories when possible. Just like I just mentioned with Jessica, she had this personal story about battling breast cancer, and she was able to use that to advocate for more scientific research. So think about your own life. I mean, we have a lot of stories that we've experienced ourselves, and we can infuse that into our op-eds. I mean, that's really, really important that you're able to tell those personal stories there too, and that you don't just put a lot of facts and figures and things like that, because honestly, people like reading about people. Honestly, at the end of the day, people like reading about people. So make sure you have something personal in there too. Use humor if it's appropriate, of course. If it's not appropriate, leave it out. Don't take a chance. If it's a really serious topic and you kind of throw in a joke there and it falls flat, you don't want to do that. So consider if humor is appropriate for the piece that you're working on. Use clear language, not jargon. I think in working with scientists, this is the one thing too that I drive home. We can't use jargon. We can't use, there are a lot of sciencey terms out there, right, that we use. When you're writing an op-ed, typically you're writing for a general audience. And so you want to use clear language. You want the reader to be able to understand, right, what you're trying to convey. And so if you use jargon or if you use language that they're not familiar with, again, they won't read it. Your point won't get across. Your message will fall flat. The editor likely won't know what you're talking about and will probably reject the op-ed. So if you use clear language, also write in use direct sentences, don't use passive voice, use active voice when you're writing your sentences. All of those are good tips to help you as you write your op-ed. Additional writing tips: provide a conclusion up high. Tell what you want to have happen in your piece. Do you want Congress to fund a bill related to more diversity in STEM? Do you want the Combating Sexual Harassment Act in STEM to be passed? Do you want more money in the federal budget for science? All of these things are your quote unquote asks that you want to put up high. You want the readers to know why you're writing the piece. So make sure you have a conclusion up high. I think people tend to want to put the conclusion at the bottom. So you write all of the information and then you want to say, in summary, I want this. Well, you want to do that up high. You want the reader and the editor especially, because the editor is going to make the decision on whether or not your piece gets published. So you want to make sure that up high, you're telling the reader what you want to have happen in your piece. As I just mentioned, use active voice, use strong verbs. Make sure you're not using the passive voice, because again, that's something I think would turn off an editor and would decrease your chances of getting published. Write for the average reader. Again, that goes back to my point about not using jargon. So you have to make sure that you're writing for the average reader. You want to think about someone who may not be a scientist. You want to think about someone who might not be an expertise in whatever you're writing about, and you want to write for that average person. And then again, restate what you want to have happen at the end of your piece. So just like you do it, just like you put it up high, you want to restate again at the end of the piece what you want to have happen. And then you want to get ready to submit. So before you submit your op-ed, what you want to do is include a brief bio with your phone number and your email. And you want to copy and paste your op-ed within the body of an email. This is actually really, really important. Editors have told me over the years, never ever send attachments. Attachments get lost in spam folders. They never see it. So you want to make sure that you copy and paste the body of your op-ed within the body of an email and then send it off. And typically I allow between 3 to 5 days before following up with an editor, but it's important that you follow up, because again, even if you do everything that I just said, sometimes it still gets lost in spam. I don't know how, but sometimes it does. And so it's important that you follow up with an editor and you say, hey, I just submitted that op-ed a couple of days ago. Have you seen it? Is this something that you're interested in publishing? I think will be good for your publication. And then an editor will say, oh yeah, I've seen it, give me a few more days, or no, I never got that op-ed. I don't, I haven't seen it. Can you send it to me? It sounds really interesting. And then, you may need to resend again at that point. So now we're going to put our hats on. We're going to pretend that we are editors. What I would like for you to do is, based on everything that I've just shared with you, think about which op-ed you would publish. So I have 2 op-eds here, and I want you to take a few minutes and read them over, and then we're going to take a poll and see which one you would publish if you were the editor. Okay, so as you can see, the poll is up there. So you can make your choice between A or B, and then we'll discuss. Fantastic. So it looks like 85% would choose op-ed B, And that is the correct answer. And I want to discuss a little bit because I saw that there were 15% who chose A. First, we'll talk a little bit about why not A. So if you read through A, it's just not clear to me where we're going with this op-ed. In the first sentence, we're talking about John McCain. In the next sentence, we're talking about President Obama being worthy of a commencement invitation. It's just really kind of all over the place. And so an editor looking at that is going to scratch their head and just wonder, what is this person trying to say here? It's not clear, it's not succinct, it doesn't really grab your attention. However, in op-ed letter B on liquid helium, it does, right? Immediately, that this is about helium. This is going to be about helium's contribution to innovation, how helium is crucial to MR scanners in the hospitals, how it's fostered a development of billion dollar industries, fueled essential life-saving medical tools. It's really clear what you're trying to say in B. And I have to admit, I worked with a writer on op-ed B, and that op-ed made it into the New York Times, which is a really, really high bar to meet. This person, I have to admit, he was very good to work with. He knew immediately what he wanted to say about helium. He had been concerned about the volatility in prices. And he said, but helium is, just plays such a crucial role in innovation and all of the things that are important in our lives. And I said, we got to say that up high. And we did, and we worked with the editor, and it was accepted in the New York Times. And so it just goes to show you that it's important that you make sure that you're very clear about what it is you want to say. And in A, it's not clear to me at all, just where the writer is going with this piece. And so these are two different illustrations of types of op-eds. But again, you don't want to write the first one. You want to write the second one because it drives home the point very clearly that helium is important to our country. So that's all I have for you. If we want to take some time right now to go into Q&A, I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.
So I'll share the Padlet board link is there in the chat if you want to pose questions, or also feel free to raise your hand and ask question. But I'm checking the chat as well if there are any specific.
Thank you.
But so I do have a question regarding a point that you made about controversial. And this is something that it's kind of been going on for a while, especially on the topic of, there's so misinformation out there, and there's so much difference between facts and opinions. Mm-hmm. And the controversial topics, sometimes it can bring up your different ideas or point of view, but also it can start some of these, I'm going drastically here into, say, conspiracy theories type of thing. So how can we, balance that type of communicate, like the controversiality of things?
I think that you have to, from a scientist point of view, for this audience, I would say, scientists really do have the truth on their side. I understand that there may be conspiracy theories out there, for example, related to the vaccine or other issues, but the science really is settled on a lot of issues like climate change. And I think you just have to hammer that home. You just have to stand your ground and hammer that home, that you have the truth. There's a consensus out there related to certain issues, and you just continue to underscore that. Folks, I think, are going to continue to write or say what they want to write, But again, you have the truth on your side, especially as a scientist. So you have to just drive those points home.
So I'm sharing the Padlet board. There's another question there. And there was a question related also in the chat regarding the jargon. I mean,
right.
Exactly what does it count as jargon? Because it feels like sometimes the op-ed, the language that you use, it's above average readers, in fact, and it might include some level of jargon. So what is a good line there too?
So I think if you're introducing a term, for example, I was just working with an APS member on an op-ed, and we introduced a term called emerging research institutions. What I did was I put an M dash after that term, and then I said, these are institutions that don't receive as much research money as major institutions based on equipment constraints and other issues. So you wanna try and maybe describe what the issue is. If it's a really important term, you can always add an M dash at the end of the term and then offer a couple of words to kind of describe what the word is in layman's terms, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so there are specific examples. So like they say, is it the use of acronyms? Okay, for example, saying quantum information science. So that is a field. It might, and then often refer as QIS, and then you refer, but like some more widely known, let's say like CERN, and spelling out. What is your advice on?
So I see so if you write out quantum information science and then you do QIS in parentheses afterwards, you can use QIS on subsequent references, but you have to spell it out first.
And how about like CERN or?
And with CERN, I think so. Some acronyms are more well known than others. So I think CERN would be okay. You wouldn't necessarily have to write that out. There are certain acronyms that editors are very, very familiar with, like FBI, NAACP. There are certain NASA. There are just certain acronyms that are very familiar to editors, and they don't write them out because they're so commonplace. People will immediately recognize what they are. CERN is probably one of those ones too that I think, especially if you're writing for science, if you're submitting this op-ed to science, definitely folks are going to know what CERN is. But if you're writing for a more general publication, they may not know, so you may have to write it out on the first reference.
So there is a very interesting question here who has gotten a lot of likes. There are disagreements within science. Is there a succinct way to address that without causing more confusion? And actually, this is a very, very important question, particularly because I've been reading a lot about science misinformation and distrust in science. And one of the things that they recommend is, show consensus when you are expressing information about, okay, like 80% or 90%, I don't know, I'm making numbers up, of scientists and researchers agree that vaccines are, protect you at least 60% from the worst symptoms of the virus. But at the same time, there is another point within the people who are studying, those type of issues to say, well, we also need to show that science is messy and that, we are doing our best with the current amount of data and the resources that we have to measure things. That doesn't mean that things cannot change. So how do you work this through when you're writing an op-ed?
I think just what you just said. I think making sure that you cite the statistics related to whatever the consensus is on that particular issue. I mean, you can acknowledge what the critics are saying, But you have to realize you're writing an op-ed for a reason, to make a point, right? To drive home your own position. So while you can acknowledge that tension that I talked about earlier, the point of your op-ed, though, let's be clear, is for you to make a point about an issue. So if you're making the point that, you know, we all should be vaccinated, then yes, cite your statistics that show why that is the case. And, you know, you can say, you know, some critics may argue this, but here's what, you know, the consensus on the issue is. And therefore, I think this. So it's important that, yeah, you acknowledge that tension and you can hint at it, but you are writing an op-ed. So an op-ed is, you're advocating for some sort of position, some sort of statement on a particular issue. So you don't want to get so caught up in the messy part that you referenced. You want to make sure that you're driving home your own point about why you're writing this op-ed.
Right, not ignoring it, but not making it the focus.
Right, exactly, because that's not the purpose of an op-ed.
Right.
Yeah.
So another question is here related to, what about if you wanted to write an op-ed anonymously? Do they accept that, or there is an option for that?
So I'm glad you brought that up. No, editors will never, ever accept an anonymous op-ed. I've never seen it. It just doesn't happen. It's important. If you feel strongly enough about why you're writing an op-ed, you should be able to put your name on it. Editors are not going to accept it. They will accept multiple authors on an op-ed. I've worked with APS members over the years where one or two people may be on an op-ed, but again, in that case, they're both releasing their names. So yeah, editors definitely stay away from anything written anonymously. They're not going to accept it.
Right. So another question here is, if you are writing an op-ed that might be connected to a certain date or event, such as a historic anniversary holiday, what is the best time to submit it for? And you gave a great example with your daughter and the Black Lives Matter movement.
Okay, sure. So I would say you want to tie something to, let's see here. I think February is Heart Health Month. You know, you might want to check in with the editor a couple of weeks and say, you know, hey, I'm interested in writing this piece. I know that Heart Health Month is coming up. I think it would be perfect timing. And then write the piece. I would get it into the editor at least a week before you want to see it actually published, and just go from there. But that's a good question, because that talks about timeliness, right? And the importance of submitting an op-ed connected to an event. You want to make sure that you have a good solid news hook. And so tying it to some sort of historic event or anniversary or holiday is an excellent idea.
And another question here. So what is better, a unilateral, strong, effective, provocative argument, or a very cautious, plural discourse, which, however, pleases everyone and risks having little effectiveness?
Strong, effective, provocative, yes. You don't want a weak argument, because then an editor won't want to run your piece. So you want a strong, effective argument. You want to make the case for whatever it is you want to make the case. You should be very passionate about whatever it is you're writing about.
And then here, I know you mentioned this, but so it says on the APS website that we work with members to publish op-eds in their local newspaper. So who would be a good person to get in touch with at APS to publish their own op-eds or get some information?
You can get in touch with me. You can get in touch with me via email. I'm at tjohnson@aps.org.
And then I'll put that on the chat so that it's easier for people to access, but it's easier to find you also on the website.
Yes.
But I also have another more practical question. It was related. So I remember when I was once a grad student and I was asked, so like, why don't you write an op-ed about that? And I had no idea where to even go to understand the process for doing that. Will you have some pointers? How do we look at which is the right place for, how can we define what the right place to publish our op-eds, or at least offer to publish our op-eds
Sure.
is? And then how do we get in touch with the editors? How do we find who is the person that we need to get in touch for that?
Sure. So as far as where to publish an op-ed, it depends on what you want to write about. But in general, your local newspapers or your local publications, which are all pretty much online these days, is a good place to start. And you can just Google them. You can look up the op-ed editor. Typically, they will have submission guidelines all online for you to follow. There will be an email address that will tell you where to send the op-ed to. Again, some publications go into more detail than others. Sometimes you have to dig a little bit more to find out where to send it, but typically you can find it online. And I will say this about where to publish an op-ed. In my experience, where we have used op-eds to advocate for our science policy goals, people might think, oh, why don't you go for the Washington Post? Why don't you go for the New York Times? Those publications are extremely hard to get into. And over my 14 years, I've worked with APS members to get an op-ed in the Washington Post once and the New York Times once. Everything else has primarily been local newspapers, more well-known papers like the Chicago Tribune, some other papers like the Dallas Morning News, Austin Statesman, those papers as well. But all of those papers were local to the writer. So meaning that the writer lived in that town, the writer did research maybe at the university in that town. So the writer had some sort of connection to the paper in terms of proximity, where they lived or where they worked. So make sure you're thinking about your local papers. Don't automatically aim for the really high tiered papers, because I will say that, again, those papers get thousands of submissions every day. They're also locked into their regular columnists who appear on those pages. So when they give space to other writers, they don't allot very much space. So they may accept an op-ed or two from someone else who isn't a columnist, maybe on a weekly basis, maybe less than that. So it's something for you to consider when you're thinking about submission. Do not overlook your local publications. Also, I will add, online, there are a lot of new online sites, right, that have popped up related to places where you can place your op-ed. I've worked with APS members to get placed on Slate. Medium is another outlet you might want to think about. These are really up and coming places where there's some really, really great writing on these places. And so don't overlook them as well.
So that is good. And also I wanted to say we have a blog, that the Physics Bus blog, that it is you can start, if you are as scared as me for writing and testing these things out, you can send your blog post and we can promote it on our site as a maybe not as scary audience for you to reach out.
Yeah, so just get out there, you won't get it published, right, if you don't try, if you don't give it a shot. Just hammer it out. And also I would say, let someone else look at it too. Put some other eyes on it. And I would say that's important, not just from copy editing standpoint, where you might miss a period or you might have some grammatical issues, but content clarity, That's all important. You want to make sure that somebody else understands what it is you're trying to convey before you send it off to the editor. Because then, you know, if there's maybe a point that you need to clarify or kind of work over a bit before you submit it, then you will have done yourself a big favor before, you know, an editor tells you, oh, we can't publish this. You know, I don't understand what you're, you know, what you're trying to say here. And you know, and if you do get rejected, it's okay. Keep trying. You know, I will say that, keep trying. Editors don't often tell you why they're not publishing your piece. They'll just say, oh, I can't publish it. Sometimes I've pressed them to say, well, is there something that I can do? You know, do you need me to clarify an argument? And then some ignore me. Some will write back and say, well, you know what, this is really good piece. I just don't have the space right now to run it. Like, I'm backlogged with, you know, 20 op-eds right now. And so I can't run your piece right now. And so maybe it's timing is the issue. And so maybe you can revisit it another time. But if you press some of the editors a little bit, they will give you some feedback on, you know, what you can do to get your piece published.
So 2 questions that are sort of related. One is, should we ask to get paid for an op-ed? And then the other, which is kind of like opposite but related, is there a cost to the author for publication if their op-eds gets accepted?
Okay, should you ask to get paid? No, don't ask to get paid. It is wonderful that you are even getting published in this online publication or your local newspaper, because again, remember, they are getting hundreds of submission every day. So the fact that your piece was chosen, that's an award of itself. Some publications, I will add, do pay, however. I know I just worked with the APS president, Jim Gates, and another author to get a piece in The Hill, which is one of 3 main Capitol Hill newspapers. And they published their piece online. And there was an offer to pay them based on like how many readers read it or clicks that they got, but they both declined. You know, they said, you know, we're okay with that. We don't need that. So sometimes papers will say to you, you know, do you want to get paid? And if so, here's the policy that we have in place. You know, you'll get a rate based on this. And so they'll outline the whole policy for you, but definitely don't ask. And no, there is no cost. There's no cost to pay to have your op-ed published. Typically, newspapers, online publications, they are yearning for good content. They want people to continue to submit. So they will not charge you any money for submission.
And you would share some extra reference and resources, right? About how to like contact different.
Yeah, I'm happy if anybody really wants to give this a shot. You want to like write an op-ed and you let me know where you live, what sites you might be interested in. Sure, I'm happy to give some advice and some contacts related to editors and email addresses and that sort of thing. And I also, within my slides, which I understand will be posted on the Path Lab, also have various references.
One more question is, if an op-ed is accepted, what should we expect in the editing and publishing process? Like, will they make changes? What revision aspects should we know?
Very, very, very good question. So always put a headline. You might think of it, call it a title, but in journalism jargon, we call it the headline. So it summarizes, you know, why you're writing this. Always put that up at the top of your op-ed, because it lets the editor know what you feel is most important about this op-ed. Oftentimes, however, an editor will change the headline. But what they will do is, after the editor goes through the editing process, the editor will kick the op-ed back to you and say, hey, look, this is what we're thinking about for the final publication here. Please look it over, make sure that, everything is correct. They won't just edit it and then publish it and not give you an opportunity to look it over. Because, let's face it, sometimes even editors make mistakes. So you have to make sure that you go over it very carefully and make sure that the integrity of your piece is still there, that the editor hasn't edited in an error by mistake. And so you'll have an opportunity to look that over. But that process for me over the years and working with APS members has been, it's been a pretty good one. I will admit that helium op-ed that was in the poll there, going through the New York Times with that, it was a bear. We had the editor checked every single link, not just once, multiple times. We were asked for additional information related to helium, everything that you could imagine. It was a really rough editing process, but in the end, it turned out well. It definitely thickened my skin because it was a difficult process. But we realized, hey, we're getting in the New York Times, and that's a big deal. So just make sure that you have thick skin about the whole editing process, because sometimes you may think, well, why is the editor doing that? Why did the editor change this or change that? But they have a lot of experience doing this. They know what their readers typically like. They're doing this based on their own experience. So just trust that process too, that you're working with a good editor, you've chosen a good publication to put your piece in, and this editor has a lot of experience typically and will not make your piece worse. So
this is the last question that we have time for, and it's you touched on it just now, but related to reference or links, which are, it's normally you don't see it on the op-eds. How do we make sure that those are included? And is there a difference if you are publishing your local news versus the New York Times versus probably like a scientific magazine like Physics Today or any other magazine in the scientific world?
Okay, I want to understand that one again. So are we asking whether or not to include the links, or
how do we add the references, and if the references are like the amount of reference and the type of publications that you should reference change depending on where are you writing your OPED at?
Sure. So I will say in general, if you're citing a report, if you're citing a document, if you're citing statistics, embed that link within the body of the email so that within the op-ed, excuse me. Embed the link within the body of the op-ed where you introduce that particular reference. So if you say, according to the National Science Foundation science indicators, where you introduce the National Science Foundation indicators, you can hyperlink there and take the editor straight to the place where you're citing. What a hyperlink should not do is take an editor all over the place to like the front page of a report. You want it to go exactly to the place where you're getting your statistics, where you're getting your information from. Don't include footnotes because footnotes never appear in an op-ed. So you don't have to do that. And yes, some publications will be more rigorous with checking references than others. Again, as I mentioned, the New York Times was a bear to work with, but again, it was fantastic that I was able to work with an APS member to get him published in the New York Times. But other local papers may not be as rigorous, but I just think that it's important to show the editor that you've done your research. And so you can hyperlink to, again, those reports, those documents, and make sure that they go directly to the place where you're citing that particular piece of information.
All right, thank you so much, Tawanda, for your wonderful walk us through the process of writing an OpEd. I surely learn a lot. I still think I need a little bit more, I don't know, get brave enough to do it. But
you just gotta do it. You gotta get in there, Claudia. Don't be afraid.
I'm a scary cat when it comes to those things. But also thank you to the audience for participating and coming up. Please check out any other, we have 2 very cool events coming up about how to design programs that include particularly inclusive diversity and equity objective into the program. And then also how to combine art to express your scientific research and ideas. And also other events that public engagement is doing is a Juneteenth Freedom Day editathon, Sunday, June 20th. So we will give you a brief introduction of the art of editing Wikipedia pages and creating Wikipedia pages. And then we will work together on highlighting pages for hidden figures, as our colleagues from Black in Physics have pointed it out. We're partnering with them to run this event. And then also the Wiki Scientist course, who hopefully will run August to September. Other coming events will be, we're trying to build a network of people interested in public engagement and research, so stay tuned for that. And then there's also a survey regarding the landscape of public engagement in physics across the US if you want to fill it out. So with that, I let you all go, and thank you so much again for your participation.
Thank you, it was my pleasure.